So welcome back to the studio stage, and we now have some couple of people that are searching for a place to sit down and get relaxed for the next talk of Bernhard and Martin about how flow controllers and OpenAPI specs are best friends. So welcome on stage, Martin and Bernhard.
Hello. There. So, when we think about external APIs, there are usually two kinds of experiences people have. First one, there is APIs which just work, behave as expected. You implement them once and can use them for years, have fun. And there are others. And just a short story. Once a colleague mounted a target to the wall in our office where she would throw stuff whenever an external API we had to use behaved unspecified. And that target got used a lot. So something is complicated with APIs. And why is that so? First of all, it's just JSON, so we are 2025. It could be simple, one thing, but there are a lot of things you have to know about an API to make actual use of it. First of all, you have to know it exists, what endpoints are there, can be used, what parameters do they allow, and what will the API return? So there may be different return codes, and the data structures may change whether a result was found or not, or an operation was successful or not. And in the result, there is data. And there are usually multiple fields, so there's room for typos, just simple as that. And there's also room for type errors. Is it a string? Is it an integer? And there's also confusion whether a field can be null or can be optional. So that's not irrelevant for code usually. So in any cases, when something happens or behaves unexpectedly, usually code breaks, like when a property is suddenly missing, and we were expecting it to be null, if it is, or it cannot be empty or something like that. So whenever our expectations are not matched, usually code breaks. That is some struggle in the beginning. We're used to that, we will fix it, but it gets more complicated over time when APIs change and we have to communicate the changes, which often happens in the form of XML snippets in tickets or JSON snippets in tickets that get sent around. And after a while, you don't have any central understanding what this API does or what it returns, what kind of data it returns in total, but only the collected emails of multiple years, and then you can try to onboard a new developer to use this API. So this is not optimal, and there should be a better way in 2025. And of course, write documentation. And usually you find the requirement for an API that there has to be documentation. But for documentation to actually help you in future, needs that the documentation has to be correct in the first place, but it's not enough. It also has to be complete, and it has to be up to date. So it has to reflect all the changes that were ever made to this API. And documentation can come in different forms, like URL examples or Confluence pages, PDF documents, or even worse, PowerPoint presentations. We've seen them all, and they don't work well, especially when we want to communicate changes to APIs. So that was the status quo about 1.5 years ago, when we were starting a big project where we wanted to implement a hotel booking engine that was to be used for multiple hotel brands. We knew the front-end application would be a React app, and it would be challenging because booking engines are complex, and we wanted to achieve a smooth user experience. It should feel easy for the customer. It should be snappy. And we also knew we would, in the back end, have to talk to an old XML API in a standard from the 90s that is wrapped in SOAP, was documented in a PDF that was created in 2013 and annotated ever since, but sometimes half-heartedly. So we knew talking to this XML API would be a challenge. There would be issues, and combined with the challenge of implementing a smooth user experience in the front end, there could be madness. Luckily, in between, there was Neos, and that is the thing we have under control. And what we thought is we might get this project actually under control if we ensure that the communication between the front end and the Neos works really smoothly, and no issues there. Everyone knows what data is sent and what to expect. Because in that case, the front-end development could focus on implementing a smooth API, just dealing with responsiveness and all this madness in there, and the back-end development would only deal with XML madness. So that was the plan, and with that, we started the project, and at first, in the setup phase, we added a ticket to automatically create the documentation for the APIs we were to present to the front end from the back end. Automatically, that actually matches the PHP implementation. It could not deviate. So in the setup phase, we wanted to do that. A thing that was not written in this ticket was, of course, we want to write modern PHP code, we want to be type safe, and we want to apply static analysis to all the code. Also, we preferred OpenAPI as a standard. We had worked with that before, and mostly successfully, but we were kind of open for that. And with that, we started, and just a small recap, I think most of you have already seen an OpenAPI. An OpenAPI specification is a JSON document. The OpenAPI standard started as part of Swagger and is a JSON that allows you to specify all the things you have to know about an API. So it contains the endpoints, which are called passes there, and all the parameters they expect in the pass or in the query or maybe as JSON header, and also the possible responses and the data in there. And there is also a possibility to centralize some definitions so that it can be used in multiple endpoints. That is all nice and fine, and the best thing about OpenAPI with this JSON format is that it can be versioned. So it is quite easily to keep track of changes to API specifications. So whenever we want to change something, we can have a diff in our version control system. And another big advantage of OpenAPI is that there are tons of tooling which support it, but they only are fun when the API are really, really correctly or matches the spec. So it's not just let's write an API. We have to really ensure that this technical specification actually matches the implementation. At that point, we were optimistic that we would not have to reinvent the wheel. So we started looking for solutions because surely someone has done that before. And we looked into many solutions for PHP, and those are the major ones. First one was Swagger PHP, and that one mainly collects annotations from your code and combines them to an API specification. Well, that is nice, but no one can guarantee you that the annotation in your code actually matches the implementation. And even worse, the annotation is placed before a function while the implementation is below. So it can easily slip the review if you change any functionality that you also have to adjust the annotation. So that was something that would pretty surely lead to an API that does, or a spec that does not match the implementation. And for that reason, we skipped Swagger API. Another thing we evaluated was JNPHP. That is a tool that takes an OpenAPI specification and generates PHP code. So we would have to turn the stuff around and generate the specification first and our code later. But that would have been OK for us. Sadly, JNPHP currently creates PHP 7 code. So no type safety in there, just annotations, tons of getters and setters, and that does not feel like 2025 or 2024. Last thing we checked is API platform, and that is a tool that is built on top of Symfony, and that creates all sorts of API for your Symfony application. And we actually tried it twice. First, I tried to use packages they published that say they can generate specs for that mainly describe what Symfony serializers would do. And I was not able to get it to run because of dependency hell. Afterwards, Bernhard gave it a try as well. And when that failed, I knew that was not a package for us. So it's actually, if you have a Symfony project, it may be the way to go, or it may work. But getting it to run without Symfony was pure pain, and we were ultimately not successful. So sometimes new wheels have to be invented, and Bernhard will show you what kind of wheel we came up with.
So yes, after trying out the Symfony approach for some time, after a few days, I thought like, okay, why is this actually so hard? I didn't try, I actually did it. I read the documentation and the specification for OpenAPI. And I was like, okay, these are the type declarations, these are the path declarations. You can do this in PHP natively, you can do this in native PHP. Okay, we might need an attribute here, you can do this in native PHP. Why do we need some configuration, factory? Why can't we just use the PHP code we write? As you may hopefully know, the PHP type system has evolved a lot in the last years. So the idea was, okay, if we drop support for PHP 5, 7, and so on, and start on the base of PHP 8.2, can we do this easier? The answer is obviously yes. So the idea was, what if we take a step back, we implement our endpoint in modern PHP and try to generate the OpenAPI spec from the code we already wrote. Because there isn't too much difference when it comes to types. That should be doable with clicking a button or running a CLI command. And that was the goal. So where do we start? So here we have an example controller, like an endpoint that we implemented a base controller for, the OpenAPI controller. We have an action that is called. And what we basically have is one command, because we want to send, I don't know, an email or to write something to the database, so we're doing a post request. Everything that was put into a form is part of this command. Then we have a handler for that command, and whether that succeeds or fails means that we have to send a different response, right? And all of this can be modeled in PHP objects, like the register thread deliverers command is a PHP object, and so are the two responses, the success or the failure message. The only attribute we need here is the one describing that this parameter, this command, is to be sent via a request body, because the router has no chance of knowing that. And also the specification needs that to be rendered, and this can't be derived from the code without that attribute. But apart from that, that's just basically a controller. You would write exactly that way anyway. What our package does is the whole deserialization and serialization, so you don't have to take care of, do I have to make this command JSON serializable or these responses JSON serializable? Just write them in a certain way, which we'll see in the next slides, and you're done. So no hassle with that. Parameters. There are a few things you have to take care of. So we say, okay, let's write modern PHP, so you have to do that. We only accept final read-only classes. They're modeled as value objects, so they can also only consist of other value objects, in our case, and primitives are okay also. So you have that command with the offer ID that is to be used in the context, the travelers to be registered. You can have collections, given they have a variadic argument in the constructor, like this 3-dot thingy, so you can add an arbitrary amount of travelers to that collection, and it has to have a items property. So if it looks like that, we're all set. We can use enums, for example, because that's why we need at least PHP 8.1, but H2 for the read-only classes. And OpenAPI has a specification for enums, so does PHP nowadays. So if you can just use them, and they work exactly as you'd expect. You can add a few attributes, mainly for metadata. If you want to add a description to your type, you can also, of course, do that, but you don't have to if you don't want to. So yeah, there are quite some requirements to your code base. You also have to add flow proxy false, because otherwise the serialization wouldn't work, but you don't need proxies here anyway, because don't inject stuff into value objects, please. But that's basically the only requirement. So the return values basically work the same, just build another class the same way. In this case, we have just basically a message property, but if you're doing a query instead of command, this might be the result list of stuff. And you can set a status code. So this is, for example, this worked message with a status code of 200, and the 400 status code if it didn't work. Just beware that OpenAPI only supports one message per status type, per status code. Apart from that, they exactly work as the parameters do. And after running, so we have a command prepared so that you can run to create the JSON file that represents the OpenAPI schema. And you can also use a special endpoint that will provide the schema in the exact same way. And you can, for example, use Swagger UI to just present your API with all the types and endpoints. So what does this mean of the implementation? So we do get documentation from code. So the promise is, yes, as long as you do make use of the PHP 8.2 type system, and then you'll get the API documentation for free. You basically don't have to do anything anymore. It's readable, both for humans via the UI that we just saw, and also it's machine readable for static analysis, and especially for both sides, right? So it's statically analyzable, both in PHP and in JavaScript on the other end. We had the topic of versioning, right? You can check in, you check in the code into your Git repository, and you can add that rendered document as well, and you can verify it. And on the client side, there are tons of generators for like API clients in JavaScript. As long as you give them a valid OpenAPI spec document, you're just fine. So that's nice in theory. I mean, there are the nice thing about implementing a standard is that the standard basically provides the test cases, and we made extensive use of that. So what could possibly go wrong? Not much, actually. We used that in set project. It definitely changed the way backend and frontend developers work together. So before that, in our team, it was like, okay, let's talk a bit, define some JSON file or some JSON spec, write it into a ticket, and yeah, that will probably work for the next time. That has improved a lot because we now, of course, have an up-to-date specification. And that's actually a place where also both parts, front and backend, can actually negotiate, right? So after that, everyone should be reasonably happy within the team. And you can basically encapsulate everything that's behind that layer, right? So if you have set XML madness, just encapsulate that into some repository and give it a clean API via this one. So it was done. It was for that hotel project, and it works basically in all instances for all hotel chains. So it's also very reusable, which is also a nice thing about this. Then what I already mentioned, so we can have some kind of workshop format where you sit together with at least front-end and back-end developers. You can then discuss the API specification, then you just write a line of PHP code to adjust some object or create a new one, reload the whole Swagger UI, and you already see the results for everyone easily understandable, even if they don't read PHP usually. So yes, the next step is, of course, for frontend to generate the clients. That's the point where I'm like, okay, do whatever you want. That's not my cup of tea, but it seems to work reasonably well, to be very well used in production. So what that meant for our project, so basically before you had the typical action controller, but the action controller uses the property mapper, and if you try to property map a value object, that's basically you have to write the serializer yourself because it's not designed for that, right? It's designed to edit entities via the properties. So in this case, this can't handle entities, but it can handle value objects very well. Another approach previously was to write middlewares, where you serialize and deserialize value objects yourself by passing the property mapper, but you then have routing and security issues, and mostly you use that way. That's not a problem. And yes, you get, of course, the specification for free and don't have to look up in tickets, for example. So it became the de facto standard for both of our teams.
So, of course, this is the best thing since sliced bread, but it still has some limitations. It cannot walk your dog. No, there is a serious limitation. You may be familiar with the parameters we all use in PHP, those square bracket things that are nested and may describe arrays of properties, and we all use them all the time. And I should have gotten curious when I noticed that the PSR URL standard does not deal with them, because turns out they are not standardized. So there is no standard which describes what happens there. It's just implemented in HTTP, or what's called HTTP build query or parse string in often the PHP side. And OpenAPI does not support that. It supports an style for encoding URL parameters that is called deep objects, which on the first glance looks like PHP parameter encoding because it has square brackets, but turns out with deep they mean one level deep. And no arrays, please. So it may work in some cases, but you will surely hit a hard spot quite soon. OpenAPI implements an RFC for a URI template that does not support nested arguments. And there isn't a workaround with the current version of OpenAPI yet. There may be support for custom queries in future releases of OpenAPI. But for now, we cannot use that. We have workarounds. The first thing you can do is just flatten your parameters. If you want a GET request, you can pass around easily. It's tedious. It does not look good. But it works. And GET parameters are really easy to debug. And the thing we use in application all the time, and Bernhard already showed it, is use a request body with content type JSON for complex arguments. And there you can use an object as complicated as you want, and that works like a charm for complex requests. So that is what we use at the moment until the API spec gets more sophisticated in that regard. There are also some constraints, or no limitations regarding constraints, because in many cases you want to express more than just it's an integer. It might be a positive integer, it might be a string that matches a specific pattern, it might be a class name, and OpenAPI allows to specify that. But since we wanted to generate the specification from the code, we would need a way to determine those limitations that, on the one hand, we can enforce via PHP, and we can ensure via reflection that this constraint is in place. We did not find a way to do that now, so currently our specs only deal with simple types and nested structures of those. But if anyone comes up with an idea, we will surely implement it because there's much value in that, and we would love to implement constraints for values. Another limitation we currently have is that we did not care about authorization yet. We just use it for public APIs. But OpenAPI is totally able to describe multiple authorization schemas. There is bearer tokens, username, password, API keys. There can be multiple headers or stuff like that. It's OAuth and whatever. So OpenAPI will be able to describe it, and we simply did not get around to implement it yet. But we will implement it once we need it, and we already have projects that will likely use that or require that. So that is a limitation that will go away quite soon. But we also have other ideas for the future, and that is, again, for Bernhard.
Yep. So, I mean, the obvious next step would be being compatible to NEOS and Flow 9, but we're already done with that. So you can use that in your new projects as well. But we could do some architectural stuff, right? So there are a lot of framework agnostic parts, like the serializer and unserializer, that are very specific for this use case, that could just be extracted in another package that can also be reused in other parts. We are currently in the Zeitgeist namespace, obviously. We could transfer that to Flowpack in the first step. We could use it, for example, for interaction with the NEOS UI to make that type safe. There are currently a lot of arrays being passed around. We don't like those too much. And it could perhaps be a core feature in the future like we could separate the action controller into parts, like yeah, we have a CRUD controller if you want to deal with entities and the property mapper, or you can have an OpenAPI controller handling OpenAPI requests. And we are also not the only ones dealing with this topic right now. So Basti has also released a package which can do similar things, the OpenAPI types package. And that's always something that sounds like, hey, perhaps we should stick our heads together and create a Neo solution that we can use in the core.
So, and there's a last idea I would love to check out. I already heard the term MCP multiple times already. And MCP is a separate protocol which allows language models to communicate with resources and tools. And it turns out there are bridges that connect or that provide a connection from MCP to OpenAPI. And that might be a way for us to have fast iterations when we are experimenting with tools we want to provide to a language model. And I would love to check that out and see what kind of API has to be given to a language model to actually get successful results. But Bastian, as shown in the keynote, Bastian exposed mainly the API of the content repository. That is an obvious start, but we learned in other projects that the usefulness of tools for language models largely depend on what exactly the tools are provided. So they may be even more useful if we have a way to fast iterate on the APIs we actually provide and try it out and see what comes out in the end. So we would love that, and I hope no one will do it before us, but it is possible. We just have to find the time. So,
thanks a lot.
That's all from us.
Thank you, Bernhard and Martin. And I've got a question for you. Why not use JSON in the query for complex parameters?
Yes, I guess that's one for me because we're exactly doing that. So we're cheating a bit, and we're using the deep object parameter type also for GET requests. So we have like a query parameter called query, and then you input JSON. That works reasonably well, but it breaks type safety a bit on the JavaScript part because that has to be like JSON stringified, and then the linter says, okay, I can't pass this. What is this? But that's a front-end issue, so it was like, okay, not my problem.
Thank you. And let's check.
But it should be possible by adding an annotation that you want this parameter encoded as JSON.
Yeah.
So thank you for your questions. If you have further questions, please contact Martin and Bernhard directly. And I think we have a present.
Yes, we do.
Toby, come up on stage. It's late in the afternoon, I know.
I have one, yeah.
Thank you.
So thank you for your talk. Thank you for being here. And rate the talk. And we have one last talk here on this stage. And it's about 7-Site, the journey of building a Neo SaaS platform. And